I never planned to become a politician. My story began in the crowded apartments and tenant meetings of New York City, not in campaign offices or boardrooms. Before I ever spoke on the assembly floor, I was sitting with families in living rooms filled with eviction notices and unpaid rent bills, listening to stories that felt painfully familiar. I worked as a housing counselor, helping tenants fight back against landlords who treated homes like investments instead of the lifelines they are. I learned early that the housing crisis wasn't just a policy issue. It was a question of dignity, of who gets to belong in a city built on the labor of working people. Every week I met tenants who had done everything right, worked long hours, paid their rent, raised their children, and still faced the threat of losing their homes. I saw how the system was designed to make people feel small, to convince them that eviction was their fault rather than the product of greed and neglect. I remember sitting in housing court, watching lawyers in suits shuffle papers that decided the fate of families who didn't have anyone to speak for them. That was when I understood that if the system felt unchangeable, it was because those in power benefited from keeping it that way. My job wasn't just to help individuals survive it. It was to help them organize to change it. In Astoria, I began working with tenants who were ready to fight back. We went door to door, building trust, building community, and slowly building power. When landlords tried to raise rents illegally, we documented every detail. When they let buildings fall into disrepair, we gathered evidence and went public. The first time a group of tenants decided to go on rent strike, it was terrifying. But it was also transformative. People who had felt powerless began to see that their voices, when joined together, carried weight. It wasn't about anger, it was about justice, and justice, I realized, doesn't come from waiting, it comes from organizing. When I eventually ran for office, I carried all those stories with me. I didn't have corporate donors or political connections. What I had was a community that believed we could build something different. My campaign wasn't about slogans or photo ops. It was about conversations on stoops, in bodegas, outside subway stations, the same places where I had listened for years. Every person I met reminded me why this fight mattered. When we won, it wasn't just my victory, it was proof that working class people could challenge power and win. Inside the assembly, I've tried to bring that same grassroots energy to every decision I make. I've pushed for stronger rent protections, for real affordable housing, for policies that center people instead of profit. Every vote, every bill, every speech is shaped by the faces I met long before politics, the tenants who refused to give up, the families who turned despair into solidarity, and the neighborhood that taught me what community truly means. When I first joined the Democratic Socialists of America, it wasn't out of ideology, it was out of experience. I had seen too many people work full-time and still be unable to afford rent. Too many families trapped by systems designed to profit from their pain. The word socialist to me wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was rooted in something deeply human, the belief that people deserve to live with dignity, not desperation. Growing up in New York City, I saw what inequality looked like up close. Luxury condos rose beside shelters. Tenants worked double shifts while developers got tax breaks. It became clear that the status quo wasn't broken, it was functioning exactly as intended, for the few at the expense of the many. When I began organizing, the Democratic Socialists of America gave me language for what I was already feeling. It helped me understand that housing justice, healthcare, and fair wages weren't separate struggles, but connected pieces of the same system that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. I wasn't interested in tweaking policies around the edges. I wanted to change the foundation. Being part of DSA wasn't about party loyalty, it was about solidarity, the kind that grows when people realize their struggles are shared, when a tenant in Queens sees their story reflected in a worker in the Bronx or a nurse in Brooklyn. It's about standing together even when the odds are against you, because that's when solidarity matters most. When I ran for office, people told me to stay away from the word socialist. They said it would cost me votes, that New Yorkers weren't ready for it. But I knew that if we led with honesty, people would listen. I told them socialism to me meant that no one should be poor in a city as wealthy as ours. It meant that healthcare shouldn't depend on your paycheck, that housing shouldn't depend on your luck, and that our government should serve people, not corporations. When we knocked on doors and had those conversations, I saw how quickly that message resonated. People were tired of politicians who talked about change but governed in fear of upsetting power. They wanted someone who would actually confront it. In the Assembly, that's what I've tried to do. I've stood with my colleagues in the Democratic Socialist Caucus to push for policies that shift power away from the wealthy and back into the hands of workers, tenants, and ordinary New Yorkers. We fought for good cause eviction, for public power, for taxing the rich to fund the services everyone deserves. And while the pushback from lobbyists and establishment figures is constant, I've learned that progress isn't measured by how comfortable you make those in power. It's measured by how much courage you inspire in the people who have been left out of it. For me, being a progressive leader isn't about holding office. It's about holding the line for the future we believe in. It's about understanding that real reform doesn't come from compromise with injustice. It comes from building a movement strong enough to replace it. I was born in Kampala, Uganda, a place full of stories, struggles, and histories that seemed larger than life. My father, Zohran Mamdani, is an academic whose work has always been about understanding the forces that shape societies, the way power operates, and how people resist it. My mother, Mira Nair, is a filmmaker, someone who captures the beauty, pain, and complexity of human lives on screen. Growing up in a household shaped by these two worlds, one deeply analytical, the other profoundly creative, taught me early that the personal and the political are inseparable. You cannot understand people's lives without understanding the systems that constrain them. And you cannot tell stories about justice without listening carefully to those who live it. Even though I moved to New York City at a young age, I carried with me the rhythms, sounds, and memories of Uganda. The stories my parents told about history, about exile and return, about resistance and survival, became part of how I saw the world. I learned that identity is not a single line, not just where you are born or where you live, but the convergence of histories, struggles, and cultures that shape who you are. Being the child of immigrants meant understanding early that belonging is never guaranteed, that even in a place that calls itself home, you have to fight to claim your space. That awareness stayed with me as I walked the streets of Queens and began noticing the inequities in housing, education, and opportunity around me. My parents' work also taught me about responsibility. Watching my father write and teach about justice, and my mother create films that gave voice to the voiceless, I understood that talent and education carry a duty, the duty to engage, to challenge, and to lift others as you rise. I carried that sense of responsibility into my own life, not through academia or filmmaking, but through organizing and politics. I realized that the lessons of my childhood, the importance of listening, of questioning authority, of valuing the experiences of marginalized people, were not just abstract ideals. They were tools for building movements, for understanding communities, for crafting policies that reflect human needs instead of profit. Being connected to immigrant roots also gave me a perspective on the struggles of others. I could empathize with families living in fear of eviction, with workers who had sacrificed everything only to be undervalued, with children trying to find their place in a city that often feels indifferent. I understood that displacement, systemic inequality, and the fight for dignity are not abstract concepts. They are lived experiences that cross borders, cultures, and generations. My parents taught me that storytelling matters, that narrative shapes how the world sees people and their struggles. It is that understanding that has informed how I approach organizing, how I approach politics, and how I see my role as a public servant. Even as I navigate the complexities of New York politics, my immigrant roots remind me that I carry more than my own story. I carry the histories of the people who came before me, the struggles of those around me, and the responsibility to make space for those whose voices are often ignored. It is that connection to place, to family, and to community that continues to shape my life, my values, and the work I dedicate myself to every day. When I first began working in Astoria, Queens, I didn't see myself as a politician. I saw myself as a neighbor, someone who shared the streets, the buses, and the struggles of the community. Walking through Astoria, you see a city of contradictions. Families who have lived here for generations struggling to afford rent. New developments rising that seem designed to push them out. And local businesses fighting to survive alongside global chains. It became clear to me early on that this neighborhood, like so many others, had been left out of the conversations that shaped the city. People were working harder than ever, yet they were being told they had to accept displacement, rising costs, and shrinking resources as inevitable. I realized that if I wanted to make change, I had to start by listening, really listening to the people whose lives were being most affected. I spent countless hours knocking on doors, sitting in living rooms, and attending tenant meetings. I listened to stories of parents working multiple jobs while worrying about rent, of young people trying to stay in neighborhoods they grew up in, and of elderly residents being pushed out of homes they had lived in for decades. These weren't abstract issues. They were urgent, personal, and often painful. I learned that representation isn't just about holding a seat in government. It's about carrying the voices of the people you serve into every decision you make. Every story I heard informed how I approached organizing and later how I approached campaigning. The community taught me that empowerment doesn't come from speeches or policies alone. It comes from building trust, showing up consistently, and standing shoulder to shoulder with people as they fight for their rights. Running for office in Astoria was not about ambition, it was about responsibility. I knew that working class families had been underrepresented for too long, that their concerns had been filtered through layers of bureaucracy and political expediency. My campaign was built on the principle that the people closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. We held meetings in libraries, community centers, and parks. Volunteers went door to door not just to ask for votes, but to listen, to learn, and to amplify the concerns of everyday people. I learned quickly that when communities are engaged, informed, and organized, they have the power to shape the policies that affect their lives. That realization guided everything I did, from the campaign to my work in office. Since taking office, I've tried to carry that same ethos into the assembly. Astoria's working class communities face challenges that are often overlooked: rising rents, limited access to quality schools, health care disparities, and inadequate public services. I've made it a point to focus on legislation that directly addresses these issues while also pushing for broader systemic changes that empower communities citywide. But even as I work within the formal structures of government, I am reminded constantly that my role is not to speak for the people of Astoria, but to amplify their voices. Their struggles, their resilience, and their ingenuity guide the work I do every day. Being a community voice is not just about policy, it's about presence. It's about showing up when people feel forgotten, about listening when they feel unheard, and about fighting alongside them to create a neighborhood where working families can thrive, where children can grow up with opportunity, and where residents know that their city belongs to them as much as it does to anyone else. From the beginning of my work in New York City, I understood that politics is not about titles, offices, or votes. It is about people, the families struggling to make rent, the workers who cannot take a sick day without risking their livelihoods, the neighbors who feel invisible in a city that tells them they must compete for scraps. I came to politics because I saw how systems that are supposed to protect us often fail the people they are meant to serve. Housing, healthcare, and dignity are not luxuries for the fortunate or privileges for the well-connected. They are fundamental human rights. That belief has guided every step of my work, from organizing tenants in Astoria to standing on the assembly floor, and it continues to shape the policies I fight for every day. Working with tenants early in my career revealed how urgent this philosophy was. Families were being displaced not because they failed to work hard, but because the system allowed landlords to profit from their insecurity. I watched parents make impossible choices between paying rent and buying food, between medical care and keeping the lights on. These were not isolated incidents, but patterns rooted in policy decisions, economic structures, and political inaction. I realized that advocating for housing as a human right meant challenging those systems directly. It meant pushing for rent stabilization, tenant protections, and investment in truly affordable housing. But it also meant ensuring that the people affected had a voice, that they were part of the decisions being made about their own lives. Healthcare is another arena where this philosophy has guided my work. I met countless families who delayed or avoided medical treatment because they could not afford it, whose lives were jeopardized by a system that prioritizes profit over care. I came to see that access to health care is inseparable from the idea of human dignity. No one should have to choose between survival and financial ruin, and no one should be punished for circumstances beyond their control. I have carried those experiences into my legislative work, advocating for policies that expand access, reduce inequities, and protect the most vulnerable. I have learned that people-first politics requires more than passing bills. It requires listening, learning, and ensuring that the systems we create actually serve those who need them most. Dignity, for me, is the thread that connects housing and healthcare to everything else. It is the principle that guides my decisions, that reminds me why politics exists in the first place. Whether it's standing with tenants fighting eviction, workers demanding fair wages, or families seeking access to essential services, the focus must always be on human lives and well-being. This means rejecting compromises that leave the most marginalized behind, questioning policies that prioritize profit over people, and holding power accountable in ways that center the lived experiences of ordinary New Yorkers. People-first politics is not theoretical. It is grounded in the stories and struggles of the community. It is about showing up, listening, and ensuring that every policy, every vote, and every decision is measured against its impact on real lives. It is about building a city where housing is secure, healthcare is accessible, and every individual is treated with dignity and respect, where no one is made to feel expendable because of circumstances they were born into or the zip code they live in.